Hello, I'm Tiff Roberts, a fellow with the Marine and Mike Mansfield Center at the University of Montana. I would like to start by thanking Denise May, who will provide American Sign Language interpretation for our event tonight. I am honored to welcome you to tonight's event by Bloomberg News reporter Pete Martin, author of the new book, China's Civilian Army, The Making of Wolf Warrior Diplomacy. Our moderator tonight will be Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian, the China reporter at Axios, and formerly a reporter and writer at Foreign Policy. The Marine and Mike Mansfield Center is an academic unit of the University of Montana dedicated to enhancing mutual understanding between the United States and Asia and fostering ethical public policy and leadership. The center supports this mission by fostering university and community links with Asia and dialogue on issues facing the United States, Asia, and the world. Established in 1983 with an endowment from the United States Congress, the center honors the legacy of Senator Mike Mansfield and his wife, Maureen Hayes Mansfield. In the words of Mike Mansfield, one day, America and the other nations clustered along the shores of the Pacific will be neighbors along a lake, a closely interwoven community sharing common interests and common goals, end quote. In that spirit, we welcome tonight's speakers. Pete Martin is Bloomberg News defense policy and intelligence reporter based in Washington, D.C. Previously, he was based in China, where he covered extensively the deteriorating relationship between the United States and China, traveled to the North Korean border, and also to the far western region of Xinjiang. Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian is the China reporter at Axios. Before Axios, she was the lead reporter for the International Consortium for Investigative Journalists China Cables Project. This was a major leak of classified Chinese government documents revealing the inner workings of the vast internment camps of Xinjiang. Finally, on a personal note, in an earlier incarnation, Pete and I both worked out of the same Bloomberg News bureau in Beijing. And not only did we work out of the same bureau, we actually sat right next to each other in the office at neighboring Bloomberg terminals when we weren't traveling or reporting around the country. So why do I mention that I sat next to Pete? Well, this gave me the daily opportunity to pick Pete's brain on his voluminous knowledge of Chinese politics, which was very helpful and fascinating. Well, I missed that opportunity, but that actually only makes me more excited about tonight's talk. We are very lucky to have Pete with us tonight to discuss the state of Chinese politics, as well as Bethany, who is also a real expert on China as well. With that, I would like to hand it over to Pete. Thank you, Pete.
Thanks so much. So I thought I would I'd talk a little bit about how I came to write the book, and then we can get on to some of the arguments and key findings. And it sounds like we've got lots of time for Q&A and a wide-ranging discussion later on. So I'm looking forward to that. But you know, I arrived back in China in early 2017. I'd previously lived there on and off from 2008 onwards, and had spent a little while in India and then in Washington, but arrived back in Beijing just as the kind of Chinese economy was roaring, beating estimates. China's President Xi Jinping was busy promoting the Belt and Road Infrastructure Initiative around the world. China was building a military base overseas. And perhaps most importantly, there seemed to be this incredible opportunity for China with the Trump administration busy picking fights with US allies and criticizing multilateral organizations. There seemed to be this kind of opening for China to step into a greater leadership role. But what became increasingly clear over the course of my time there was that China really wasn't able to do that. That it was incredibly effective at offering economic inducements to other countries, or using, on the other hand, kind of coercive tactics to prevent countries from acting in ways that it didn't like. But it seemed to lack the kind of secret sauce that it needed to actually persuade others of its point of view. And I started to kind of think about why that might be and why it would matter. And the reason it matters, I think, is that when you think about the kind of world that we're moving into, this is going to be a world that's no longer defined by a sole superpower, but is defined by multiple different centers of power. And one of those is going to be China. And in a world like that, where there's no one leader, there's going to be a premium on the ability to persuade others, the ability to use diplomacy, for example, to get your point of view across. That's going to be really, really crucial. And so, as I started to kind of look into that theme, I began to see Chinese diplomats as kind of a microcosm of China's broader struggle to communicate with the world. And it was really fascinating to kind of interact with them on a personal level, because these are people who have studied at Georgetown. They speak Czech and Indonesian and all kinds of impressive foreign languages. They can be suave and funny and charismatic at times, and yet when they stand up and talk in the podium in the foreign ministry during press conferences, or they sit down with their American counterparts and discuss issues, they become very stilted and ideological. And over the course of the time that I was in Beijing, they also became increasingly aggressive and assertive. And so I started to kind of look into, why was it that this country, which in so many ways excelled, seemed to struggle with that art of diplomacy that's so important for any major power. And I got, I was doing interviews as a journalist, but I also began to kind of look into this group of about 100 memoirs by former Chinese diplomats. And these are dull texts which kind of relay meeting after meeting, but they have little details in them that kind of reveal something about China's struggle. And so I took that collection of texts and the interviews that I'd done and tried to kind of pull together a book on China's approach to international diplomacy. And when I started off with the project, it was a little bit niche and kind of an academic side pursuit for me. But as the years rolled on, Chinese diplomats were, engaging in this increasingly as kind of eye-catching and surprising behavior. There were examples of Chinese envoys storming out of international meetings, telling foreign counterparts to shut up on Twitter. One group of Chinese diplomats got in a literal fist fight in Fiji over a cake that they felt had been badly decorated, and perhaps most provocatively of all, one Chinese foreign ministry spokesman spread a conspiracy theory which suggested that the US Army had started the coronavirus pandemic in Wuhan, and so it was this topic kind of became increasingly mainstream, but I kind of knew from my own research that while this kind of behavior, which is now widely called wolf warrior diplomacy, seems very new, actually its roots go back a long way. And it's interesting when you look when the PRC was founded in 1949. China basically had no diplomats to speak of. It had kicked out all of the previous government's diplomats because it thought that they were too ideologically impure to represent the PRC on the international stage. And the new government of China faced this kind of paradoxical challenge. On the one hand, it was a deeply paranoid regime which was obsessed with secrecy. It had come to power through this armed struggle and spent much of its existence as this kind of underground organization. And it's still worried about threats from the new global superpower, the United States, which was, of course, very hostile to communism and a rival government on Taiwan. So, it worried about all of those threats, but it also badly needed to build bridges with the outside world and to establish its international legitimacy. And so to square that circle, China's first foreign minister, Zhou Enlai, came up with this idea that Chinese diplomats should think and act like the People's Liberation Army in civilian clothing. So their behavior should mimic the behavior of the revolutionary army that had just brought the communists to power. And what he meant by that was that Chinese diplomats would be unfailingly loyal to the Communist Party. They would be disciplined to a fault, and they would display what he called a fighting spirit whenever China's interests were challenged. And so, together with that kind of militaristic ethos came these behaviors which were extremely distinctive and unusual, that have lasted from 1949 all the way through till today. And those included things like sticking closely to talking points, even if you can tell that those talking points don't resonate with the person sitting opposite you. Moving around in pairs, using a rule that dates back to the 1950s, which says that Chinese diplomats have to take a co-worker with them to kind of inform on their behavior and keep tabs on each other. It included shouting at foreign counterparts if Chinese diplomats felt cornered or if they worried about looking weak back home. And it meant elevating even the smallest of slights or insults into major international issues, largely, I think, because of a fear that if they didn't do so, they'd be judged disloyal back home. And so this kind of approach led to what we would now call displays of wolf warrior diplomacy right from the outset, and especially at times of domestic uncertainty. So in 1950, this kind of battle-hardened revolutionary called Wu Xiaoshuan, who had a bullet mark across his face, he led a delegation to the United Nations in New York, and he delivered a speech which Time magazine described as 2 awful hours of rasping vituperation. So you can imagine the reception that he received. And in the decades following that, Chinese diplomats were seen engaging in fights on the streets of London. They were expelled from countries ranging from Kenya to Indonesia, handing out copies of Mao Zedong's Red Book all around the world, and really behaving in a way that was just as provocative, if not even more provocative than today's Chinese diplomats. But at the same time as there was that kind of combative approach, there was also this other tendency in Chinese diplomacy, which was an instinct for China to win friends and to charm the world. At times when China's leaders decided that was the priority, they would take all of that great discipline that Zhou Enlai had demanded of China's diplomatic corps and apply it to changing people's minds and winning hearts and minds. So that was on display in the 1950s when China charmed the developing world at the Bandung Conference for Asian and African nations. And it was on display to great effect in the 1990s in the aftermath of the Tiananmen massacre, when China engaged in this kind of 2-decade-long charm offensive, which culminated, as you all know, in China's hosting of the 2008 Summer Olympics. So I kind of think of there being two tendencies in Chinese diplomacy, which cycle in and out of each other. There's this tendency to charm the world, and there's an alternate tendency to kind of shout and tell the world off. And recently, we've seen quite a decisive lurch back toward that kind of combative, abrasive, assertive approach, which has popped up so many times in modern China's history. And I think that's been driven by two things. So on the one hand, there's a new confidence in China's role in the world. And on the other hand, there are these kind of enduring insecurities that exist alongside that new confidence. So I think the new confidence really started around 2008. And China had hosted the Olympics, but then the world was hit by the global financial crisis. And Chinese leaders watched as Western countries had this kind of slow, ponderous response to the crisis. But their own system proved capable of unleashing a massive stimulus package, which created problems for the Chinese economy in the long term, but in the short term was widely hailed as helping to save the global economy. And they started to look around and to think, well, we've been told for all of these decades that we had to take lessons from the West, but actually maybe there's something to our system and maybe we don't need to take lessons anymore. And the upshot of that was a move toward a much more assertive style of Chinese diplomacy, which began in that 2008 to 9 period, but really ramped up after the current president, Xi Jinping, became boss of the Communist Party in 2012. And at the same time, under Xi Jinping, Chinese politics has become an increasingly tense and even scary place. So Xi launched a sweeping anti-corruption campaign across China, which punished more than 1.5 million officials. He abolished presidential term limits, setting himself up as ruler for life. He has experimented with the use of re-education camps in far Western China. And he's focused on ideology at home and has kind of drummed home this message of hostility toward Western influences in Chinese culture and especially in Chinese politics. And it's really important to kind of keep in mind that if you're a Chinese official or if you're a Chinese diplomat and you see these kinds of signals going out, there's a richness to the way that you understand that and a kind of emotional depth to the way that you're going to respond to it, which none of us have. But, over the years, Chinese diplomats have experienced multiple rounds of purges in which colleagues informed on each other and there were, major political crackdowns. In the Cultural Revolution, things got so tense inside the foreign ministry that Chinese diplomats locked Chinese ambassadors in cellars. They forced ambassadors to clean toilets, and some senior officials were even beaten until they coughed up blood. And actually, large numbers of Chinese diplomats were themselves sent to re-education camps in that period in the Chinese countryside. And so when they see this tense political atmosphere that's being driven by Xi Jinping's policies, they know exactly how high the stakes can be if they get on the wrong side of it. And so I think all of this kind of added up to set a new tone for Chinese diplomacy. When Chinese diplomats heard Xi Jinping talking in his speeches about how, China stands tall in the East, China is moving closer and closer to the center of the world stage. They started to mimic that tone in the way that they communicated with outsiders. And they also started to venerate President Xi in the way that they behaved, even handing out copies of his book on Chinese governance, just as their predecessors several decades before had handed out books, Mao Zedong's little red book, at similar events. And that kind of new tone really went into high gear after the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic. So China was under attack, of course, internationally for its role in covering up the virus in the very early months of its spread. But it also, China's leaders looked around and they felt like their model had been vindicated. After all, the virus was spreading rampantly in the United States and all across Europe. And China did manage to contain the spread of the virus after the initial outbreak. And so they kind of felt like, once more, why do we need to learn lessons from the West? Why do we need to show deference? And the result was a series of outbursts from Chinese diplomats across the world, which were apparently cheered on by President Xi, who even issued a handwritten note to the foreign ministry calling for more fighting spirit among Chinese diplomats. It's important to remember that not everyone in China likes this new tone. There are some people in the foreign ministry and some former diplomats who have warned about the dangers that it's doing to China's reputation. And even Xi Jinping himself talked earlier this year about the need to cultivate a more lovable image for China. But I think that that call for a more lovable image just kind of served to remind us all that that Chinese diplomats and Chinese statecraft has been a little bit more frightening than lovable in recent years. And as anyone who's studied the history of the Chinese diplomatic corps knows, that kind of combative fighting spirit has been in the DNA of the foreign ministry right from the start. And so with that, why don't I pause my remarks, and I'd love to discuss some of these themes further.
Great. Thank you so much, Pete, for that really excellent summary of your book. And I'm so excited now to be able to talk about how much I love Pete's book. He knows this. So this is my copy of Pete's book. I was so excited when I heard it was coming out that I couldn't wait for the actual bound version of it. So I emailed his publisher or PR person and got like a spiral bound, like printed out copy of it that I have filled with copious notes. So it's a great book. It's a great read. Strongly recommend it if our event tonight sort of piques your interest in it. First of all, let's talk about the title of the book, China's Civilian Army. Where does that title come from? What is it a reference to?
It's a reference to a speech that Zhou Enlai gave very early on in the foreign ministry. When he inherited this situation where he'd got like a small band of followers behind him who had been helping him do foreign affairs stuff on and off for years, but most of the people who made up China's early foreign ministry had never been overseas. They didn't speak foreign languages. They had, really no clue what they were doing when it came to diplomacy. They've been fighting wars for the last couple of decades, and they were daunted by this task that was laid out in front of them. And Zhou kind of came up with this idea that Chinese diplomats would act like a civilian army, kind of as a shorthand, I think, to help them understand the task in front of them. And he said, you've been engaged in one kind of battle for the last few decades, and now you're going to fight a different kind of war, but this time it's going to be a diplomatic war instead of, a military conflict with real fighting. And, that kind of ethos just really lasted in the foreign ministry for decades and decades. And it became, even long after China needed that kind of quick start approach to diplomacy, it became a useful shorthand for the kind of extraordinary discipline that the Chinese government expects of its diplomats.
There's an interesting example, or maybe it's an example. You can tell me if I'm misinterpreting it, but chapter 3 begins with this really fascinating scene. And I'm actually going to read a little bit of it. So, as Chairman Mao greeted Romania's new ambassador to China in March 1950, so this is like right after the founding of the People's Republic, 10 former People's Liberation Army generals peeked through small holes in an ornate door. The generals watched carefully, craning their necks as the ambassador presented his credentials. It was a bewildering experience. How can anyone remember all that gibberish? Geng Biao asked his colleagues when it was over. You just say anything you want. The other side won't understand anyway, countered Ji Pengfei. Just make sure the comrade translating says the right thing. So these generals were about to become some of the very first Chinese ambassadors posted overseas. I love this story for a couple of reasons. I think it demonstrates so well the idea of having to build a foreign ministry from the ground up. And also, the idea that it was literally PLA generals who were going to become the first ambassadors. But I also want you to talk about how you came up with this scene. How did you piece this scene together of these generals craning through like cracks in a wood door?
Yeah, it was it was pretty painstaking work. So I can't remember the first time I came across it, but I remember these books, these memoirs by these Chinese diplomats are written in such dull, kind of repetitive language.
I can't even imagine.
I
can imagine.
Exactly. and so you kind of have to they'll just like throw these anecdotes out as if it's like nothing more remarkable than any of the other kind of bureaucratic detail that's gone before it. And you kind of pause for a second and think, wow, this is really compelling, but then it's really short on detail. And also, of course, these are books that were written in the 1990s or 2000s describing events that happened in the 1950s. So you've also got a kind of accuracy problem there. And so what I did was to just find as many references as I could to that scene from as many different people as I could. And that, some people said that they were peeking through a door. There was another person who said they were peeking. It was kind of one of those screen things that you often see in China. But anyway, you just do your best to kind of triangulate the accounts and figure out what's accurate. And so that's how that scene worked.
Yeah, and I pull that as an example to demonstrate for the audience the kind of work that went into this book, and it's real original work too. Pete went through more than 100 memoirs, which is, he really should get a medal for that. To pull out these really interesting scenes that we didn't know, that none of us knew about. I don't think you mentioned this in your talk. Where does the term wolf warrior diplomacy come from? Forgive me. Did you already talk about that?
No, I didn't. And it's important. So the term comes from this 2017 blockbuster movie that was released in China, which is kind of this sort of like Rambo style action adventure with Chinese heroes battling foreign enemies on the continent of Africa. It's not my thing, but it was a wild commercial success in China. And I think what happened was that the movie picked up on this sense at that time that China's moment had arrived, and that China no longer needed to show the kind of caution and deference to the outside world that it had once shown. So the movie was a great success. And about the same time, I guess Chinese diplomats kind of made a similar set of assumptions about the way the world was moving and the way that they needed to behave. And as they started acting in this kind of brash way internationally, the foreign media started to use this phrase wolf warrior diplomacy to describe their actions. And it's a name that stuck.
Yeah, I think at the very end of that movie, I haven't actually seen it, I've just read multiple summaries of it, but at the very end, as I've read, there's some scene where like the guy is like, and the moral of the story is no matter where you are in the world, if you're a Chinese citizen, the Chinese government will come and will protect you. You can rely on the Chinese government. And it was such I think it's actually quite a heavy-handed message, but also a really meaningful one, because I think Chinese citizens for a long time, and like including in the Qing dynasty, so in the imperial era, Chinese people abroad weren't protected. They really weren't. Look at what happened to Chinese people in the United States, after 1882. And so I know that this was like a big, signal, not just to say that China theoretically is strong, but that it actually matters for individual people abroad as well, or Chinese people who want to go abroad.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And, it's something it's really easy for us to forget this idea that Chinese people have felt kind of like their country is weak and that they're not protected by it for a long time, and they felt humiliated by that. And that's something that also kind of played into the way that Chinese diplomacy evolved.
Yeah, and I think that this maybe, tell me your perspective on this. I think that a lot of maybe people in China don't have whether it's in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or just sort of average Chinese people, may not have a sense of how this comes across because they see themselves as such underdogs. What do you think about that?
I think that's exactly right. So when I ask Chinese diplomats about this term wolf warrior diplomacy, how do you feel about it? The response is, we're just defending ourselves. They feel like they're being attacked for their economic system, their political system, their policies in minority areas, their foreign policy, their military approach. Everything is under attack. And in some cases, the people who launch those attacks question the right of the Communist Party to govern China. And to them, that's the absolute most sensitive red line that you can go near. And so they kind of feel like, well, we're just standing up for ourselves. You guys stand up for yourselves. Why are you calling us names as a result? And, of course, you can pick that kind of line of reasoning apart and point out why, China is now a very, very powerful country, and maybe it should reassess some of those attitudes. But that's certainly how it feels, I think, to a lot of people on the Chinese side.
It's interesting on the topic of the Wolf Warrior 2 movie. There's actually right now another huge blockbuster, very propaganda nationalist film that is, it's sweeping the box offices, likely to become the highest grossing film in the Chinese market this year, which means that in the world's market, because the Chinese box office is the largest box office in the world right now. It's called The Battle at Lake Changjin, and it actually, one of the characters in that movie is the hero of Wolf Warrior 2. Just, on this sort of theme, what's going on that Battle of Lake Changjin now is also, super nationalist film. Oh, it's about Chinese soldiers fighting American soldiers in the Korean War. What's going on that these movies are so popular? And are they really, is it actually popular, or is like the Chinese government fiddling with the numbers?
I think the Chinese government has kind of hit on a winning formula when it comes to these patriotic movies. For a long time, the kind of films that the Chinese government hoped would make it big were not tremendously successful, and they were kind of clunky efforts at propaganda. But people like these action movies. They lap them up in China, just like the Rambo movies were lapped up here and beyond. And that's mixed, of course, with a message about China's place in the world. And as you said, that's, there's been this deep-seated hope and expectation that that China's place in the world would change, and that the country would win back some of the respect that it had when, in the 19th century, it was the largest economy in the world and was this great empire that was then shattered. And there's this acute awareness in China, as that that was taken from the country, and that it's the job of any Chinese patriot to take it back. So I think that these movies kind of capture this sense that maybe now is that moment.
You've talked a lot about how some part of this is a a reaction to perceived and real slights by the West, a history of colonialism, a sense of being oppressed by the West. But the interesting thing about this sort of new aggression by Chinese diplomats is that it isn't always aimed at Western countries. I mean, there's been very similar examples of Chinese diplomats saying really, really harsh things on Twitter or elsewhere to India, Sri Lanka, Venezuela. What's behind that? What's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Twitter in particular has kind of given Chinese diplomats a bit of a platform to perform to Beijing. I think in the past, if you were posted to somewhere that wasn't the United States or France or somewhere, Vienna, somewhere that was very diplomatically important, it was a little bit tough to kind of show off your credentials to your ultimate bosses back in China. And I think Twitter has provided this platform. On the one hand, people understand that Xi Jinping has these incredibly high expectations for the confidence that Chinese diplomats should show around the world, and the respect that they should demand from their interlocutors. And Chinese diplomats now have access to this platform where they can pick fights with people who criticize China, or in some cases even resort to name calling, and they can show that they too are on board with this project. They can take the messages that she's put out there, and if they're ambitious and they're looking for promotion or advancement in their career, maybe they'll even add a little bit of extra zeal just for good measure.
Do you think that what do you think the effects of this have been in China's international power, the way that it's perceived? Has it in fact, has it made people afraid of China in a way that gives China more power, or has it made people afraid of China in a way that diminishes China's soft power because people no longer view it as a friend?
Yeah, so I think that the overall impact has been pretty damaging. If you look at international opinion polling on perceptions of China, those who have a negative view of China, the numbers behind that have just increased dramatically over the last couple of years. If you talk to politicians in places ranging from India to Papua New Guinea to Australia, Britain, Canada, you name it, the political elites are worried about the way that China is conducting itself, and what that might mean for their national interests and the security of their citizens. And I think what it's done is, wolf warrior diplomacy has come as kind of part of a package of assertive policies, right? That China has pursued industrial policies which have alienated foreign businesses. It's pursued military assertiveness, disinformation campaigns overseas, and influence campaigns, and all kinds of other things. But for a long time, there was kind of a mismatch between those very assertive sets of behavior and the very relatively sort of soft and ameliorative way that Chinese diplomats express themselves. And what I think wolf warrior diplomacy has done is to bring those two worlds together. Now there's a human face on that kind of assertiveness, and it looks like Chinese diplomats. I think overall it's been pretty damaging.
There was perhaps it was Xi Jinping or someone, I can't remember who it was, but a few months ago, some very top Chinese official made a speech. And it was I think it was Xi Jinping. It was taken as, let's walk this back a little bit. Do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah.
Right.
Let's talk about that. Are we going to see a sort of a pullback from some of this?
Yeah. So it's really important. And it was a meeting in June, I think, of the Politburo, which is the kind of top governing body in China. And they hold these study sessions from time to time. So it was at one of these study sessions, and Xi Jinping gave these remarks where he said that China needed to cultivate a more lovable image in the world, and that there had been pushback against China and damage done to its reputation, and that it also needed to strive for greater respectability. And so I think that was kind of a tacit acknowledgement on Xi's part that he understood that some of China's behaviors have kind of resulted in a backlash. But at the same, it was very striking at the same time. He also talked about the need in that speech for I think, discourse struggle, which is a very, kind of communist way of saying, taking the fight to the world and making China's case and being assertive about it. And I think what was really notable for me about those comments was the idea that China will succeed if it can just get the messaging right, if it can just tell its story better. And there was no acknowledgement there that human rights groups are shocked at what's happening in Xinjiang or Hong Kong, or that Chinese business practices have created legitimate grievances across the world, or that any of these other policies are about to shift. And so I think as long as there's no acknowledgement of that, she can talk about kind of modest adjustments, but it's not going to amount to very much.
One thing I really love about your book, and I've told you this before, is that you portray Chinese diplomats in such a human way. You don't just treat them as representatives of their government. You look at how they think about their career, how they think about their families, how they deal with the kinds of political pressures that they face. I'd love to hear some more about that.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of moving in places, because a lot of the diplomats, especially in the early years, who China sent overseas, these were people who had come from, in some cases, extreme poverty in the Chinese countryside, and had joined the Communist Party in the hope of building a better version of China, and of course also in the hope of creating a better future for themselves. And in these cases, of course, there were many, many, many tragic stories from those years. But in these individual cases, these were people who really had kind of pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and had gone across the world and seen places they might never have dreamt of, and brought opportunities for their families that wouldn't otherwise have been there. And they had to, these were very normal people who had this really extraordinary challenge of kind of navigating this super paranoid, kind of scary political system at home, and then this rarefied world of international diplomacy where they suddenly had to attend galas and eat fancy foods and make small talk with monarchs and all kinds of wear bow ties and do all of these kinds of other things. So I really loved delving into their stories, and it was kind of a useful reminder to me as a journalist as well, because we're often, when I think it's fair to say, we're often not the Chinese government's favorite people. And so when we interact with the Chinese state, it tends to be a bit of a sort of difficult relationship, and they're not necessarily in the mood to be their most charming. And it was really useful for me to just remember that these people have exactly the same kind of normal worries as the rest of us, and to try and humanize them a little bit.
I'd like to remind everyone in the audience that we welcome your questions. Feel free to submit them through the Q&A function. And I also have a lot of questions from earlier that were submitted before the event, which I will go through some of those as well. And let's see, I think I just have one last question. When I think of this kind of tone, very aggressive, very nationalist, the main sort of outlet for that, like pre-2016, pre-2015, was the Global Times, and the editor-in-chief of the Global Times, Hu Xijin. And for those of you who may not be familiar, the Global Times it's a Chinese I guess, party-backed newspaper known for being very fervently nationalist. What's interesting to me is the Global Times and Hu Xijin himself. I really feel like their star has risen a lot. What do you think about the role of the Global Times and also, of Hu Xijin himself?
Yeah, so again, for people listening, there was a time around 2010, 11 when this kind of nationalist tabloid newspaper in China would put out statements which were so provocative and so nationalist that they almost seemed oppositional in the way that they came across to the government, right? The Chinese government was pursuing this relatively moderate foreign policy. It was getting more assertive, but it was relatively moderate. And the Global Times was just there with this swashbuckling nationalism that seemed to kind of rock the boat. And what's really striking to me now is that whereas 10 years ago they felt like kind of an outsider voice, now they feel very much like they're in the mainstream. And for me, reading Global Times editorials now, it's pretty hard to find any light between a statement from the Chinese Foreign Ministry and an editorial in the Global Times. It's the same kind of language. And so I think under Xi Jinping, we've seen Chinese nationalism go from this kind of grassroots popular movement, which sat somewhat awkwardly with the official version of Chinese nationalism, to just kind of melding into one. And is expressed best of all in the speeches of President Xi himself.
I think I lied about that being my last question. I just thought of another one. In 2020, and you did address this a little bit in your talk just now. I think, we saw just such a dramatic downward spiral in relations between China and the US during the pandemic, when the Trump administration sort of declared war a bit on China. The feeling appeared to be mutual. I was curious to see if, when the Biden administration came in, if things would kind of calm down a little bit on both sides. What have you seen from, both sides, Biden, the U.S. side and the Chinese side, since the Biden administration transition?
Yeah, so it was really striking, actually, that the interactions that I have had with Chinese officials and people who have spoken to Chinese officials suggest that there was this expectation on the part of the Chinese government that Trump had been wild and crazy, but Biden was a known entity and he was going to come back in and things were going to return to normal. And I think that shows that lots of people in the Chinese government weren't paying close enough attention, because actually the forces that led to this change in US-China policy are very deep-seated and predate Trump quite considerably. And are not just confined to the Republican Party. But anyway, that seems to have been the expectation. And so when the Biden administration has kind of come in and taken a pretty tough tone toward Beijing on issues ranging from human rights to China's territorial ambitions in the South China Sea, I think that officials in China have been pretty upset and worried by that, and that has resulted in this kind of nearly year-long kind of state of suspended animation in relations, where there have been a few sporadic meetings between top US officials and top Chinese diplomats, one of which resulted in China's most senior diplomat, Yang Jiechi, delivering a 17-minute diatribe to Secretary of State Antony Blinken, but really not very much concrete progress. And I think just in the last few weeks, with the release of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou from detention in Canada, and kind of this talk about a virtual summit between Xi and Biden, we've started to see just like a little bit of movement. But I don't think anyone should hold their breath for things to improve too quickly, because all of those underlying sources of tension that we've already discussed are still there, and they're still going to exert a great impact on the direction of relations.
Okay. tons of questions from the audience. I don't think we'll be able to get through all of them. Lots of good ones. Here's an interesting one. How will wolf warrior diplomacy sort of interact with the coming Winter Olympics?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, you know, when China last hosted the Olympics, it had kind of it had this whole package of policies, but also diplomacy and propaganda that kind of went together to bolster its image in the world. So China had been opening up its economy to the outside. It had taken a pretty reserved attitude towards its territorial disputes with its neighbors. It had been, you know, creating Confucius institutes around the world to teach people the Chinese language. And, you know, its diplomats had also not been in wolf warrior mode at all. They'd been in this kind of this phase of trying to reassure the world that China's human rights record would improve, but also that China was no threat to the outside. And I think, you know, as China hosts the Olympics this time, it's striking that on almost all of those fronts, the situation is completely different. China's economic reforms are widely seen to have stopped or stalled. And it's pursuing a kind of industrial policy that really upsets people in the West. China is taking a very assertive approach to its territorial disputes with its neighbors, and using these fleets of kind of militarized fishing ships to intimidate them in maritime disputes. Its diplomats are shouting at people around the world, and it's using its external propaganda efforts also in a way that makes a lot of governments and foreign citizens very, very uncomfortable. And so I guess the way that wolf warrior diplomacy fits in is kind of as part of that bigger picture. You know, China has changed its mind about the way that it needs to act in order to win respect in the world. It now seems to think that instead of persuasion, it can rely on the sheer size of its economy and the might of its military to command respect. And wolf warrior diplomacy kind of gets wrapped up in that package.
Great. This is a question from us that was submitted earlier today before the event. Does an individual boycott of buying Chinese-made goods make any difference? And I can think of, there's no further context to it, but I can think of maybe two different contexts. Maybe you could address both. One of them is maybe with Uyghur forced labor, goods made through Uyghur forced labor. But the other one would be, I guess, helping to promote US industry in the face of China's industrial policy.
Gosh, I mean, I think that the sad truth is that it's pretty difficult for an individual. You know, China's economy is massive, and it's pretty difficult for any individual to make too much difference. But of course, you know, it's always good to keep your own personal consumption in line with your own ethical beliefs. The difficulty, of course, when it comes to China is that China is involved in so many aspects of our supply chains that even goods that don't necessarily say made in China may well have components that were sourced from China, or, you know, it's a really integrated part of the global economy. And, you know, so that's difficult for individuals, and it's also difficult for governments. And one of the reasons that, you know, people are talking about a new Cold War with China, but one of the reasons that this time around will be so different to the previous Cold War is that degree of deep economic interdependence, which makes it very difficult for our governments to extricate themselves from each other. And it also makes it extremely difficult for us as consumers to try to take a role which is kind of separated out there. Bethany, I do feel though, like on the Uyghur labor question, this is an area where you have much greater expertise than me, and so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I feel like, and if the question is individual boycott, there's almost nothing that an individual can do in terms of trying not to buy things made with Uyghur forced labor. And just to give a quick background for anyone in the audience who may not be familiar, in China's northwestern region of Xinjiang, there's a number of ethnic groups. One of them is the Uyghurs. There's around 10 million of them. And China has put many of them into mass internment camps and into just a general forced labor system that is very closely interwoven with all of basically with China's supply chains and the supply chains of the rest of the world. And it's extremely difficult for like researchers who's, and their job is to find out whether or not to trace a supply chain and find out if there's any components that come from Uyghur forced labor. It's extremely difficult for even people whose job it is to do that, to know. And so there's no way for an individual to be able to do anything about that, which is why in this case, government action is so important. And we have gotten government action from Customs and Border Protection under U.S. Department of Homeland Security, who have issued various orders to when they identify shipments of goods that come in that are made with Uyghur forced labor, they can stop them at the border. But this is, it's a very systemic issue, and one in which, a system that relies on consumers to try to, basically effect change upon a foreign government's actions is not really going to work. Did you have anything else you wanted to say on that, or should I move on to another question?
Let's move on. I think your answer was great.
Okay. There's been several questions about Taiwan, so I'll just bring up Taiwan as an issue. And how is China's rise perceived in Taiwan? And does China believe that the U.S. will defend Taiwan?
Does China believe that the U.S.
Yeah, does the people in the Chinese government believe that the U.S. will defend Taiwan?
Yeah, all good questions. I lived in Taiwan for a little bit, dating myself more than a decade ago now, and have been back a few times since. I think the overwhelming perception is one of worry and concern about China's rise. It's an island of 20 million people, and so there are lots of diverse views there, as you'd expect. But I think one way to kind of think about it is that the kind of rethinking that we're now doing in the West when it comes to China happened many decades ago in Taiwan, and they went through a process where they thought about the nature of the Communist Party and its policies domestically, but also the way that it was going to approach the world, and they came to a pretty pessimistic set of conclusions, which in many ways sort of foreshadowed the approach that the rest of us that many people now are coming to in the United States. And so, in very broad brushstroke terms, there has been steadily an increase in the number of people on Taiwan who identify themselves as Taiwanese, not as Chinese, and a very steady a steady but sure decline in the number of people who are interested in reunifying with China. And that's one of the core drivers of the kind of geopolitical tensions that we see there. China says that it wants to reunify with Taiwan peacefully, but there's almost no prospect of it happening peacefully because the Taiwanese people just don't want it. And when it comes to the United States intentions, I think it's an issue where the Chinese government is sort of constantly trying to reassess and probe whether the US would intervene. And it is constantly kind of looking around the world at US behavior to figure out how much resolve there is. And something that really concerned people in the Biden White House, I think probably correctly, was that China might reassess the US commitment to Taiwan as it watched the US leave Afghanistan. that was seen as a test of US staying power and US resolve and US commitment to an ally. And I'm sure the Biden administration was worried about it. I'm sure that people in Beijing were kind of thinking about it. And the US has this policy that it describes as strategic ambiguity over Taiwan. So it's never entirely clear whether the US would intervene. But one thing that I think is very clear is that if China were ever to come to the kind of definitive assessment that the US wasn't going to help out Taiwan, and that Taiwan would be kind of left to its own devices, then the risk of a conflict would increase quite considerably.
Another question here that I think is also very interesting is, what impact is the current US political dysfunction having on China's diplomacy and messaging? No further context there, but in my mind, I think, the January 6th insurrection, we have all kinds of dysfunction, take your pick of what you want to think about.
Yeah, I think it's been a real gift actually to the Chinese Communist Party, which has long pushed this message that democracies are a mess and that they don't work for their people. And it's used that message in places actually like Taiwan. There have been some kind of scuffles and things like that in Taiwan's legislature, and the propaganda organs in China will take those incidents and amplify them to kind of say, look at what a mess this place is. Chinese citizens should never ever hope for democracy, and so that's been a kind of domestic message for a long time. But in recent years, China started to kind of take that message global as well. Russia, of course, its propaganda organs have talked about political dysfunction in the West, and China is a little bit less experienced in that game than Russia, but is becoming pretty active and has also used its English language state-controlled media to push messages about dysfunction. And the problem, of course, is that behind those messages is quite a large degree of truth. And I think that as citizens of Western countries, we're not going to agree with the conclusions necessarily that Beijing pushes there. But the simple analysis and the simple fact that they've got something to work with is a result of problems in our own system.
Okay, here's a really interesting question that was submitted from earlier today. What is Xi's alternative to Biden's rules-based order? Is China just critiquing US hypocrisy or offering a different vision?
Yeah, these are super sophisticated questions, so I'm very impressed. I think that China itself is still trying to kind of figure out the answer to that. For a long time, the message was that China had worked out a set of policies and an approach to politics and economics that worked for China, and that China as a kind of civilizational country was unique and singular, and that system, which it called socialism with Chinese characteristics, that system didn't need to apply to anywhere else in the world. China could just be let alone. And that, I discussed a little bit earlier how the 2008 to 9 financial crisis started to change that. Watching political dysfunction across the West started to change that, and then the coronavirus really sped up those kinds of assessments, and so Chinese leaders have started to speak about whether there's a Chinese model for development that other countries might want to follow, and that whether there is also a kind of Chinese vision for international order that that countries might want to consider. I don't think that vision is especially well fleshed out at the moment, but I think that there are kind of a few basic things that we might be able to tease out from Chinese language and policies about what that system would look like. It would be a system where traditional state sovereignty was at the center. No talk about universal rights, no talk about accountability for human rights violators crossing borders. But the buck stopping at the end of the nation state and not going any further than that. Praise for a variety of different political systems, including autocracies and one-party states, a focus on stability above all else. Those kind of things, I think, would kind of likely be part of a worldview, but even for a very, very powerful state, China is still kind of trying to figure out what its approach would be there. Do you agree with that, Bethany? What do you think?
Totally. I definitely do. And I think what you said about them trying to figure it out is definitely true. And we can see kind of I feel like they're getting better. We can see the trajectory of it. I mean, under Hu Jintao, like even his slogan for China was just like, 科学发展, like scientific development. Who's going to go out and march for scientific development? Like, so boring. And, Xi Jinping domestically, the China dream, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese people. That's pretty inspiring domestically. And internationally, I remember in like 2011, 2012, like having conversations with my Chinese classmates in grad school in Nanjing. And they were, in class, they were asked this question: what does China stand for in the world? And one person was like, well, China's peaceful rise. And that was definitely the thing at that time, is, 中国崛起, China's rise, or China's like 和平崛起, like peaceful rise. And it's interesting that now, I think it was perceived somewhere that understood to be perceived as a little bit too pushy. And so it became China's like peaceful development. So that was an interesting, transition there as a model. Not, this is kind of separate from the warrior diplomacy stuff, but what kind of model they're offering. So, and I remember at the time in 2011, when we were talking about this in class, thinking, that's not something, like, your peaceful rise is not something you're offering the rest of the world. You're just saying we're not going to invade you, which is like, right, great, but that's not like a gift to anybody. And I see now, a strong emphasis on, development over anything else, that there's a sense of, economic rights that, as China is trying to work on its, how it talks about human rights and to change how the world talks about human rights. They want to enshrine economic rights, the right to development. In other words, you're, against sanctions, against economic sanctions, number one, and other kinds of like, these sort of ways of shutting down another country's economy. So they're very against that. I think, that's one thing. And I also, with Afghanistan, I think this will be the first big, very direct test where the US was bombs and politics first. It was like, here are bombs and also some democracy. And China's, like, we're just going to build infrastructure, very BRI, very Belt and Road. And that's interesting to me. I wonder if they will, have better luck there, both in terms of actual outcomes and in terms of how it's perceived in Afghanistan and in the rest of the world. So
interesting.
Yeah. Let's see. We only have about 5 more minutes. I think maybe 1 or 2 more questions, and then I will hand it over back to Tiff for the ending. Oh, climate change. What about China's position on climate change globally and how its diplomats are presenting this position?
Yeah, great question. And I guess there are kind of a couple of layers. Chinese diplomats, particularly when it comes to dealing with the US, have seen climate change as a bit of an opening, right? They know that the Biden administration really places a high value on efforts to fight climate change. And so Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, has sort of talked about how you can't separate out cooperation on climate change from the rest of our bilateral relationship. And the implication there is, if you want us to cooperate with you on this issue, you're going to need to soften your stance on these other things where you're criticizing us. So they've seen that as kind of an opening, but there's quite a lot to that approach, which is really quite hollow. And the truth is that Chinese leaders see climate change as a national security imperative. Chinese citizens have long had to cope with very high levels of air pollution in their cities, and that, you know, China's leaders worry that as global temperatures rise, that the burden on their citizens, especially poorer citizens, is going to be very, very heavy, and that could be a threat to the legitimacy of the Communist Party. And so they have their own very strong reasons, quite deep felt and sincere reasons for wanting to combat climate change. And so when Chinese diplomats kind of pick it up and use it as a tactic, it rings a little bit hollow, I think, these days.
Interesting. I guess this will probably be our last question, and it's, I think, a good one to end on. The picture you draw of Chinese diplomacy seems to lead one to be pessimistic about the prospects for a collaborative relationship with other nations in the future. And this person mentions the confrontational meetings that the US Secretary of State has had with Chinese counterparts. Are we in an era of tense relations? Are there common interests that we can work together on? How can America encourage a more open exploration of common concerns?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a strange time we find ourselves living in, right? Like, you know, we just talked about the challenge of climate change. We're also in the middle of this horrendous global pandemic, which has created shared challenges across every country, and, you know, every possible incentive for us to improve ties, not just between the US and China, but you know, if we're going to be resilient against these things, we need cooperation across the board. And yet somehow domestically in our societies, and then also in our foreign policies, it seems to be really, really difficult to get to that place. And I guess in that, if there's one relationship which kind of epitomizes the difficulty of moving toward that kind of cooperative era, it's the US and China. You know, on paper, there are so, as Chinese leaders like to say, but it's kind of true. On paper, there are so many reasons to cooperate, but you have these two countries which increasingly view each other as not just competitors, but as kind of ideological and geopolitical rivals, and people in both places who have a vision of what future interaction between those two countries looks like, which is pretty zero sum. It's you win, I lose. And in truth, you know, there are political forces in the US which have led to that, but there are also deep political forces in China related to the Communist Party's desire to hold on to power and its desire to create such an environment of security for itself that it ends up muzzling sources of opposition all around the world. Those forces run really deep, and I don't really see any short-term kind of impetus for them to stop or be tempered. And so I'm really sorry to end on a pessimistic note, but I think I'm going to have to. And you know, perhaps we can next time we meet, things will be a little bit more optimistic. And
hopefully,
we can just hope. Yeah.
I hope so. Well, thanks so much, Pete. And I'm going to hand this over now. It's back to Tiff to close us out.
Thanks, Bethany.
Okay, well, we have to stop now. A huge thanks to Pete and Bethany for this absolutely fascinating conversation tonight. And also thanks to our audience for joining. I'd also just like quickly to say, if you enjoyed tonight's talk, as I'm sure you did, please do go out. I highly recommend you buying and reading Pete's book, which is quite wonderful. Thanks again, Pete and Bethany.